It is an absolutely feature-packed DAC. Assuming that it sounds fantastic, for the price and the features you get, it's a really interesting proposition. Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're taking a look at the much talked about Gustard R26 DAC. This is an R2R or ladder DAC, and it's been talked about quite a lot around the hobby lately, so I was really curious to see if this was one of those products that's actually as good as the hype and it deserves all of the conversation, or if it's one of those kind of flavour of the month new toy syndrome situations. The R26 retails for $1,650 making it a pretty affordable DAC with all the features that it has to offer. Specifically, those features are that it is an R2R or ladder-based DAC using resistor ladders to produce the sound. It's also got a 1-bit digital to analog converter in there, so if you feed it DSD, it will process the DSD through that 1-bit converter, and then I believe it also uses the ladder DAC as well. It's got a discrete circuit for handling the low-pass filtering, and what that means is that when the processing of the audio is done, converting from digital to analog, there's some high-frequency noise that needs to be removed, and that's done discreetly in here. Traditionally, when it comes to things like headphone amps and general amplifiers, I always prefer discrete designs, but I've never really looked at it in terms of within a digital to analog converter, whether the analog stage being discrete makes a big difference. I'm going to assume it does because almost always I find discrete sounds better than integrated where it uses a chip-based solution. And so I'm going to assume it's better here as well, so that's another feature going for the R26. It's also got its own built-in LAN streamer or network streamer basically. It has separate power supplies for the digital and the analog circuits of the DAC. It'll decode MQA, it's got a high quality internal clock, but will also take an external clock should you want to. And then on top of that, it also has Bluetooth with aptX HD and LDAC. So as I said, it is an absolutely feature-packed DAC. Assuming that it sounds fantastic, for the price and the features you get, it's a really interesting proposition. And so before I get into talking to you about how it does sound, let me quickly give you a rundown of what you get if you buy the R26. Now what I haven't got here in front of me is the remote control. It's a pretty basic plastic remote control, but it does the job. And then from there, on the front of the device, things are pretty simple. We've got a power button over here. We've got a nice, fairly large display. It's had a recent firmware update that improves the size of the font to make it even easier to work with. And then over here, you've got this multifunction control wheel. So we've got this spinny section around the outside and a button in the middle, and that's going to allow you to scroll through the menu, adjust the volume output from the DAC so you can attenuate the output volume if you need to. But that's all there is to it for the front panel. When we go around to the back of the DAC, things get a bit more interesting, and it's a heavy beast too. Over on this side, we've got very straightforward analog outputs, RCA and XLR. We've then got a whole range of digital inputs, things like you've got the AES, optical, coaxial SPDIF, I2S HDMI, USB-B, there's also a USB-C port, and I don't know if that's only there for firmware updates or also Signal. I never actually tried it for Signal. No doubt that'll be on the website, so check out the specs if you want to know that. You've got a Bluetooth antenna here, and then also you've got the LAN port that I mentioned before. That's an RJ45 socket, and that's for plugging in your external network to allow the streamer to function. Finally, there's a B&C connection here for an external clock, and then your power socket and your mains power switch. So there's lots going on the back of this. As I said, it is feature-packed, and the back sort of shows you everything that's going on. And that's all there is to it. In terms of the actual design, the layout, the features, the functions, it's pretty much spelled out by what I've just showed you. And then everything from there comes down to how it sounds using some of the different inputs, how it sounds in general, and some comparisons to really see how it stacks up in terms of price. Before I get deep into talking about sound, one thing I should mention is that with the R26, you've got the LAN and the USB functionality, as I said, among other inputs. But the thing I wanted to draw a little bit of attention to in case it matters to you is that when you switch over to streaming mode, it will switch off the USB mode and vice versa. And so what that means is that if you're using a software like Roon, for instance, and you're going back and forth sometimes between the USB input and the LAN input, the problem with that is that when you go between them, the system, your computer in other words, is going to lose sight of whichever one you're not on at the time. It may not be a big deal for you, it might be completely irrelevant for you, but if you're like me and there's times that you need a USB connection, say for general audio from your computer, for watching videos, doing editing, doing whatever other general things you might do, gaming perhaps, and then you want to flip over to LAN for listening to music at maximum performance, and we'll talk about performance in a second, if you're looking to do that, that's one area that the R26 is a little bit annoying. When you switch between the two, it's going to take a while before the R26 will appear again in your playback software. So do take that into account. As I said, it might be irrelevant to you. You might only want this for music listening, but if you are looking for a multifunction device, it might be a slight concern. I should add that I understand why they might be doing that, and that could be that by turning off whichever circuits aren't active, they can reduce noise in the system. So I do get why they might be doing it, but I wanted to flag it in case that's a deal breaker for you. If you're trying to work out what piece of gear you should buy next, then the Passion for Sounds Recommends database might be helpful for you. In the description box of every single video, just down here, you'll find the Passion for Sounds Recommends section. If you click on this link, it'll take you through to the Passion for Sounds Recommends Airtable database. What you'll see in here is every single product that I've ever reviewed and recommend, in some cases products that I own but maybe haven't reviewed but recommend. And then once you're in here, you can use the filter button up here to decide to filter by things like whether or not the product type is for a headphone, for example. So maybe you're looking for a headphone. Filter it by that and you can now see every headphone I recommend. You can sort it by price, which is the default sorting, or any other sorting method that you want. And then once you've got the list of products you're looking for, you've got the links to the reviews of the products, and then also purchasing links for global retailers and also regional retailers for the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So feel free to play around with this, sort it, filter it however you want to. It won't affect what anybody else sees, and you can hopefully find just the right products for you. I hope this is helpful, and now let's get back to the review. And so let's now talk about the sound quality of the Gustard R26, and I'm going to talk about it specifically in LAN mode, in other words streaming mode. And the reason for that is that for me, that's where it sounds its absolute best. And the maximum performance of the R26 is a sound that has a lovely sense of crispness and energy on leading edges, but it's still very, very smooth. This is a good example of an R2R DAC in my opinion, as opposed to some of those that get a bit softer around the edges. As we'll talk about in the comparison section, it's still not the most aggressive or attacking style DAC. It has got a touch of that R2R smoothness, but I think it's been balanced really well with a sense of energy and transient leading edge attack. Instruments like guitars have a wonderful sense of attack and resonance and harmonics to them. Vocals are rich but with a good sense of texture. And the bass is full and solid as needed. So I wouldn't describe this as an overly thick or warm sounding DAC, but it is definitely smoother than most Sigma Delta DACs you're going to try. And whilst I don't have any other R2R DACs here at the moment to compare with this one, I think it strikes a really good balance alongside other DACs like the Musician Pegasus and the Denafritt's Pontus 2 of having that nice kind of R2R fullness without falling into the trap that I think something like the Aries 2 does, where it gets just a little bit too soft. But so far, all of this is just in isolation, and sometimes what sounds fine when you listen to it on its own really doesn't stack up to some comparisons, so we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we do, I did want to talk about the performance of the R26 in different modes, and it's got quite a few of them, so bear with me as we quickly step through how it sounds with different inputs, with different source files, etc. Starting off by comparing the DSD circuit with the pure R2R circuit. And what I found was that as I listened to Memphis by the Band Loves using Roon to switch from the standard PCM file and then upsample it to DSD, what I was finding was that when I fed the DSD signal into the R26, it felt to me like I was losing a little bit of the nuance of the sound. In other words, the original PCM signal sounded better to me. It had a slightly greater sense of realism to it. When I changed over to using the DSD input, it started to sound a bit flatter in the dynamics for me. It's not to say that it sounded bad in any way, shape or form, and no doubt there'll be people out there that prefer the sound of it with DSD, but as I listened kind of into the music, sounds had a little bit more sense of three-dimensionality to them from the R2R only stage, so the PCM signal. It's not one of those situations where I'd say that you shouldn't feed this DSD, it still sounded great, But I think if you have the choice, I don't really see the benefits of giving this DSD if you can give it an equivalent PCM file. Now that might all change if you're using something like HQ Player and you find specific settings that work really well for the DSD upsampling. That might change it a little bit, and I'm not going to go into too much depth there. I am exploring HQ Player for an upcoming review, so stay tuned for that one. Make sure you subscribe. But if we're just purely talking about feeding this a PCM signal or a simple kind of software-based, and I mean in terms of player-based like Rune, HQ Player, etc., a player-based upsample to DSD, I wouldn't bother with that. Just stick with the natural file and let the DAC do its thing. If we then move over to comparing the USB input, the I2S input, and the LAN input, that's where we also start to see some interesting things. Now, I should mention here, the optical input and the coaxial input, they perform about the same as the USB input. And so really what we're saying is your traditional inputs versus the I2S input versus the LAN input. As I listened to I Wish by Stevie Wonder, what I heard was a really good sound from the USB input. Moving over to the I2S input, and that meant running it via my Singer SU6 digital-to-digital converter. Moving over to the I2S just cleaned everything up. It gave it a greater sense of articulation, clarity, a little bit smoother sound. It's not a vast leap, but it's enough that it is definitely noticeable. And then that meant that there was a slightly greater sense of energy in the sound as a result. Not aggression or attack, just that the sound was a bit more lively overall. So for me, it is worthwhile if you can give the R26 an I2S input rather than USB input, you are going to reap some dividends. But then if you can go the next step and give it a LAN input, that's really where the gold lies. And this won't be news to anyone that's read up on the R26 online. I think it's a general consensus at this point that it definitely sounds best through that network streamer mode. And so for those of you that aren't clear on what I'm talking about there, inside the R26, there is a dedicated PC board designed as essentially a network streamer. It's almost like having a Raspberry Pi or similar type device built in here. It's going to take the LAN input, feed that signal off to the DAC chip and let the DAC do its magic. And definitely for me, it's even better than the I2S input. And it's in much the same way that the I2S was better than the USB input. What I mean by that is it's more sense of clarity, more sense of smoothness, even livelier sound again, but no aggression, no attack, just a wonderful, lifelike and lively sound. I mentioned before that one of the tracks I was listening to for this test was I Wish by Stevie Wonder. This is an older recording now. It's got a slightly sort of kind of harsh-ish sound to some of the hi-hat work in that track. And as I moved from the USB to the I2S to the LAN, things like those cymbals just got easier to listen to. It wasn't that the LAN connection was smoothing it off or smoothing over details. It was just that it was more refined in the delivery. All of the clarity and all of the detail was still there at each different input type. It just got better in terms of its sense of refinement and smoothness without losing clarity. So if you do look at getting an R26, I would absolutely recommend running it in LAN mode when you can. As I said, you can still flip it over to USB or one of the other digital inputs for general usage like watching videos, playing games, etc. But if you want to hear it at its absolute best for music listening, LAN is absolutely the way to go. And the final thing I should mention on that is that when you hook up the R26 with a LAN input, it's going to be recognized by software like Rune as an endpoint, or if you're using a different piece of software like JRiver or some UPnP softwares, it's going to appear as an option for a renderer there. And so again, it's very versatile, very capable, and sounds wonderful. I'm going to get to a couple of comparisons in a moment so you can get a sense of exactly where this sits in the scheme of things. But before I get there, the one other thing I wanted to test, because I knew some of you would ask for it, is the upsampling performance of the R26. As you go through the menu structure of the R26, it gives you the ability to switch off oversampling. And what that means is you can do external oversampling through software like HQ Player, and then allow HQ Player to apply its filters rather than relying on the ones internally. As I played around with upsampling through HQ Player, using Rune as my source, and then upsampling or feeding direct into the R26 without upsampling, what I found was that using upsampling with the R26 and disabling the filters within the R26, that produced a slightly better sound than if I just went direct from Rune into the R26 with oversampling on. Now there's lots of different terminology bouncing around here, so let me pause for a moment and explain what's happening. From Rune, I had the choice of sending the output direct to the R26 through the LAN socket, or I could send it into HQ Player, which is an upsampling software that's going to reprocess the signal into a much higher sample rate, and then it would feed it out through the LAN socket once again into the R26. So identical inputs, but in one case it's going via a piece of software that is raising the sample rate of the track. Now, I know upsampling is quite a hotly debated topic. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of it here, how it's intended to work, etc. All I'm going to tell you is what I heard comparing a non-upsampled version of the track with an upsampled version of the track. What I'm then referring to as oversampling is that within the DAC itself, when it receives a normal signal and its filters are all switched on, it's actually doing a process of oversampling, which is kind of like upsampling as well. And so the idea is that you can either rely on the DAC to do all of the work of receiving the signal, processing it or oversampling it, and then spitting out the analog sound, or you can switch off the oversampling inside the DAC, do that sort of similar process externally in the software, and then feed it through to the R26. And so what I discovered after much playing around is that running the signal through HQ Player, letting it do the upsampling, and then just have the DAC decode the signal coming in and not do any of its own filtering, that produced for me a slightly more open sense of soundstage, a slightly smoother overall sound that again didn't lose any clarity. It was all about improving the refinement, then the smoothness and the naturalness of the sound without losing anything along the way. And so it's one of those occasions again where I'd say if you can run HQ Player or a similar version of oversampling and upsampling, such as PGGB for instance, any of those sorts of features are potentially going to improve the sound you're going to get from the R26. As I said before, I'm going to do a deep dive into HQ Player soon, so stay tuned for that one, make sure you're subscribed, and I'll cover it more there. But for now, let me finally get to a comparison or two to tell you if I think the R26 is great value, if it's just the same as other DACs at the same price point, or if maybe it's a true giant killer. One of the comparisons I was eager to make was to put the R26 here up against the Schiit Yggdrasil OG. I've done a number of videos now where I've put different R2R DACs up against a Schiit multi-bit design, whether it's the Bifrost 264 or the Yggdrasil OG, and the reason for that is that Schiit's multi-bit approach is not dissimilar to an R2R DAC. They do it a little bit differently, the filtering process is different, the way it uses the original signal versus the oversampled signal, that can vary as well. But in my experience, both approaches tend to produce a similar sort of sound, which is that it's got more sense of depth in the soundstage, a slightly smoother, fuller overall sound. But in many cases, I've come out preferring the Iggy OG, or the Bifrost 264, depending on the price point. And so listening to Helpless by KD Lang, I jumped back and forth between the Iggy OG and the R26 to see which I preferred. The first thing I noticed, and I was running the R26 with the I2S input, so keep in mind it can get just a little tiny bit better still if you're running it through the streaming mode. But what I heard was a wonderful clarity and naturality on the guitars in this track. The strings as well sounded fantastic. And as I carried through, I found the Iggy was just a little bit smoother on the vocals, for better or worse. The Iggy also has a slightly thicker sound to it, it's got a bit more body to it. And I don't mean that it's warm or rich or overly bassy, it's just got more sense of heft. Each note has a greater sense of weight to it, whereas the R26 is comparatively just a little bit more delicate. It's definitely not to say that the R26 sounds thin, it absolutely doesn't. It's got a lovely sense of body and presence of its own, but the Iggy's just that little bit more full-bodied if that's something you're looking for. As I went back and forth between the two of them, I actually think the difference is very, very tough to pick. It was one of those things where I really had to hone in on specific things that I was hearing and then jump back and forth to really clarify exactly where the differences lay. And that's really good news for multiple people. What that means is that if you've got a Schiit Yggdrasil OG, you've already got a wonderful sounding DAC, we know that already, and it hasn't been suddenly surpassed by some cheaper upstart. On the other hand, if you're in the market for a DAC and you're not sure what to buy, picking up an R26 for $1,650 means you can save around about $1,000 compared to the Iggy. The fact that the R26 also has the built-in streamer starts to make it a really good proposition. On the other hand, the Yggdrasil offers you 2 pairs of RCA outputs as well as the XLR. So if you're someone like me that's got multiple amplifiers, that's where the Iggy might actually be preferable if you don't need the LAN streaming or the Bluetooth. That's where the Iggy could actually pull ahead and be worth the extra money. I love the fact that I can run the Yggdrasil into a balanced headphone amp and then also into 2 different single-ended tube amps. That makes it really helpful for me. But if you're only running 1 or 2 amps, the R26 is better value in terms of the cost, it gives the sound that is different but just as good, and much more functionality. So keep that in mind, it's definitely shown itself to be very, very good value when you can pit it up against a $1,000 more expensive DAC and have them essentially indistinguishable. And so then just for giggles, I thought I wonder how close the R26 with HQ Player doing the upsampling can get to something like the M-Scaler and TT2. I didn't expect it to match the M-Scaler and TT2, but I was seriously wondering how close I could get. And what I found as I played around with it is that the R26 can get you a long, long way towards the sound of something like the TT2 and M scaler. Anyone who tells you that it can be as good or even better, I think has probably not taken a close listen. But having said that, there are also those out there that prefer a smoother sound. Maybe you're one of them. There are those who are going to like the slightly less detailed sound that comes from the R26. And that was really the difference for me. As I went back and forth between the M-Scaler TT2 and the R26 with HQ player doing the upsampling, what was really the defining factor for me was the TT2 extracted more nuance and more texture from the sound. In the hit of a cymbal, for instance, I could hear more of the shimmer of the cymbal, the texture of that sound through the TT2. In a recording of a violin being played, you can hear more of the texture of the bow grabbing at the string as it's pulled across the string. You could hear more of that from the TT2 than you could from the R26. But the R26 came very, very close. I'd say it's probably getting to 80-85%. And for $1,650 plus the cost of HQ player, it's pretty astonishing the performance it gives you. And if we then think back to something like my review of the Hollow Audio Spring and May DACs, all of a sudden, I don't have the Spring here to check, but all of a sudden, where the Spring for me never really captured my attention when compared to the Iggy, the Gustard R26 absolutely does. And it's for that reason that I'm going to say that I think the R26 is an absolute beast of a DAC. I'd love to compare it now to the A26, which is the Sigma Delta version of a similar design, and so do stay tuned. I'll see if I can get my hands on an A26. But in the short term, I'm just going to say that I think the R26 here is absolutely brilliant value for money. It's going to be definitely better than something like the Schiit Bifrost 264, which is one of my other favourite DACs below the $2,000 mark. And that means it sits really nicely up alongside things like the Schiit Yggdrasil OG that's over $2,000, and that makes this great. I'd love to put this one up against something like a Chord Cutest, but I haven't done that yet. And so in the short term, what I'm going to say is that now, for me, if someone's talking to me about a great DAC recommendation in that sort of $2,000, $3,000 budget range, even though this is well below that, I'm going to say I think the R26, the Schiit Iggy OG, and the Chord Cutest are three fantastic choices, depending on your needs. Obviously, the Cutest is smaller, it's got less outputs. This one sits somewhere in between in terms of size, but it's got much more versatility. And then the Iggy, as I said before, has its own benefits in terms of number of outputs. So there are lots of different choices and directions you could turn, but the R26 is very hard to beat, I think. And with that in mind, I'm going to highly recommend it one last time, and also say that I hope you found this video useful, helpful, and informative. If you have, I'd love it if you hit the like button, and consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.